Hello and welcome to the very first episode of the Second Adolescence podcast. I am your host, Adam James Cohen. Now you might be wondering, okay, who is this person in my ear? What's this thing about? What's happening here? These are all good questions. And so before going any further into our first episode and conversation with our first guest, let me pause and give a little backstory to both who I am and what this thing I call Second Adolescence is all about. Like many queer people, I didn't come out and start pursuing dating and relationships with my desired gender until I was an adult. I navigated middle school, high school, and college in the closet, and it wasn't until just 2 months shy of my 25th birthday that I went on my first date with a man. I'm 34 now, so this was 9 years ago. And holy smokes, that first date and the initial years that followed of pursuing dating men and figuring out how to live in my queerness were the most exhilarating and terrifying and messy and beautiful and awkward experiences of my life. I felt like I had left the world I knew in the closet for one that was foreign and way more complex than I could comprehend. One dark early morning in May 2013 found 25-year-old me 8 months into dating men and newly living in San Francisco, typing away at my computer screen. In response to the constant unrest and unease I felt at the time, I developed a morning ritual of writing out the mess that was my mind into my journal. Side note, my journal was a never-ending Google Doc lovingly entitled, "I feel fucking nuts," in all caps. It was the best. But so, yeah, I was writing about how out of control I had been feeling in response to having the most deep, unrelenting crush on another person I had ever experienced in my entire life. I thought about him constantly, wondering if he was thinking about me too. I anxiously jumped whenever my phone would chime in both hopes and fear that it was him. I stayed up late at night dreaming about holding his hand and what it would feel like to kiss his lips and what our life could be like as boyfriends. And then whenever I would return to reality, I would feel the severe stress of wondering, oh, does he feel the same way about me as I do about him? What do I do? It was just like a constant state of exhilaration and anxiety and impulsivity and erratic emotional flux. I very much felt like an adolescent experiencing love and longing for the first time. And so I was telling my journal all of this. And then the next line that came out of me was this: "I'm 25, but feel like I'm 13. 3 exclamation points. And then I feel like I'm going through adolescence again. Another adolescence, a second adolescence. And then I froze and pulled back from my computer screen and just stared at those words. Second adolescence. Something about those words just struck me to my core. It felt so true. It was what I had been feeling ever since I went on my first date with the man the summer prior. I felt this nonstop impulsivity, exhilaration, fear, and confusion. I felt awkward and insecure, this deep insecurity of self that comes from not fully understanding who you are and not being sure if you are okay with who you are. I was a queer man who still didn't feel great about being a queer man, and had spent so many years in hiding that I didn't really even know who I was as a queer man. I felt parts of myself that were so severely underdeveloped, particularly when I compared myself to my cisgender straight peers of the same age. I was 25, yes, but very much felt like I was 13 as I was navigating romantic and sexual relationships for the first time. And so I stared at those 2 words, second adolescence, for several more moments before suddenly feeling the urge to move the cursor to delete the lowercase s to then make it capitalized. I did the same thing with the A also. And then I saw it, second adolescence. And suddenly, with the help of capital letter legitimacy, I had a name for what I was feeling. I was going through a second adolescence. From that moment on, I began using second adolescence as a way to help me make sense and meaning out of what I was going through, using tools and space gained through my graduate program to become a therapist. Oh, yep, side note, I was in grad school. I started grad school to become a therapist at the exact same time I started dating men, literally within a month of each other. And I also at the time started my own personal psychotherapy. And so it was a wild time to be doing all 3 of those at once. But from both my experience in my personal psychotherapy and also in my graduate program, which placed so much emphasis on the budding therapist to get super clear on who they are, how they are, and why they are, I gained these tools and space to really start thinking about second adolescence and it became an evolving framework for me, a scaffolding to use and continuously build upon as I fumbled through the messiness that became navigating dating and relationships with men and trying to find myself as a queer person. And then around me, I also started to hear other queer people talking about feeling as though they too were going through something like a second adolescence, that they too felt underdeveloped, that they too felt behind and stunted. It wasn't just me. At the time, I thought what I needed out of second adolescence was simply to gain the experiences I missed out on in my first adolescence. The first kisses, the handholds, the sex, the falling in love, the heartbreaks, all these things that my peers got to experience in middle school, in high school, and in college. But as the years went on, I gradually came to realize that second adolescence wasn't just about gaining experiences. I also needed to look at the chronic shame that was inflicted onto me from growing up in an anti-queer world and then heal from that. And as a psychotherapist, I started seeing this experience in many of my clients over the years as well, and realized that the concept of second adolescence was really applicable to their lives too. And so that leads me here and starting this podcast now. I really think conversations about this experience are so important. On each episode of this podcast, we will hear the story of a new queer person, hearing about their experience growing up, discovering their identity, coming out, and then what their second adolescence has looked like. Each person's story will be a little different. Some may have experiences that differ from yours, and some may say things that absolutely give voice to what you went through or are currently going through. I hope all these things happen and that we can all continue to grow in community with one another and continue expanding our awareness of what life and queerness and healing can be for folks, because that's what the show is all about. And so that brings us here to this very first episode of the show. I'm so pumped to have you here with us. On this episode, you're going to hear a really interesting conversation I had with a man named Ish, who shared about what his experience was like growing up as a gay boy in Puerto Rico and within the Catholic Church, and how both of these parts of his experience interacted with the queerness he discovered within him a bit later on. And he shares about how his second adolescence really ended up involving this process of deconstructing and reconstructing his belief systems, and how this ultimately guided him to a path of figuring out how to integrate within him his faith, his Puerto Rican culture, his sexuality, and it was just such a great conversation. So I'm excited to invite you into it. After the episode, feel free to head on over to secondadolescencepod.com for show notes and more, or connect further with the show on Instagram at secondadolescencepod. Okay, that's enough for me for now. Please enjoy the conversation. Thanks for being here. Great. Well, welcome to the Second Adolescence podcast. I'm so excited to have you here and dive into this conversation.
Likewise.
And I guess just to start us off, before going anywhere, I'd like to invite guests to introduce themselves, just to give a little context for who the person is behind the voice. So I know the who are you is a big question, but who are you?
Well, that's a good question. Hi, my name is Ish. I am a gay man. I live in San Francisco. I am an educator, and I am originally from Puerto Rico. I come to this podcast after a journey of trying to understand how to juggle, mesh, synthesize 3 different parts of my life, which is my identity as a gay man, my identity as a Hispanic Puerto Rican man, and my identity as a Catholic. And I look forward to sharing some of those experiences with you.
Absolutely. Oh, I'm eager to dive into all of that. And I guess starting there, how did your story begin? Growing up in Puerto Rico, sounds like growing up within the Catholic Church. Talk to me about that. What was that like?
Yeah. So as you know, and most people might imagine, Hispanic culture is very closely tied to Christianity. Specifically, in Puerto Rico, it is Catholic Christianity. And I grew up in that. I grew up with a very vibrant Hispanic culture that includes food, it includes music, language, it includes some social roles, some social expectations, very gendered. So the word machismo often gets thrown around with regard to gender in Hispanic cultures. But yes, the word machismo, it doesn't really directly translates to sexism, but more like maleism. Like this idea that the man has to be the dominant provider, taking care of the wife. And so that deeply gendered culture was a part of my upbringing. And a key part of the Puerto Rican culture I grew up in was the Catholic faith. So even the cool kids at school on Sundays had to go to church with their families. It was as much a staple of the culture there as you might imagine. So I went to Catholic schools. I went to a Catholic all-boys high school in which those gender expectations were very much solidified. But at the same time, this Catholic faith was explored a little bit more deeply. I personally, particularly also enjoyed both my Puerto Rican culture and also my Catholic faith. Like I was these two things were important to me. And so while sometimes it seems that some people experience oppression and as a result, they decide, oh, well, I'm going to move away from this component of my life. For me, it was a little bit more, less black and white, more gray. I both loved and also felt oppressed by both of these components of my life. But yes, when I was around 12 years old, the students in my all-boys school, my classmates, were passing around a pornographic magazine with a naked woman. And that's when I realized, we might like different things. And so that's when I started getting the idea that I might be gay.
So that was the moment you were kind of seeing your peers kind of having a certain reaction to this image of woman and you were not.
Yes, that was a very blatant, poignant moment for sure. I think I had crushes when I was little. I remember having a crush on Luke Skywalker and having a crush on one of my friends from grade school. Nothing tied to a sexual attraction until it was very explicit through porn that I was like, oh, wow, these boys are into this particular body and I am not. And that's when, and that eventually started presenting some problems, as you might imagine.
Yeah, because I guess like before that moment, had you been exposed to the idea of being gay or queerness? Like what do you recall for the you prior to 12 seeing or learning about what it means to be queer?
Great question. There were some touchstones here and there. Number one, I remember watching Billy Elliot, the movie, and my dad saying something along the lines of, these gays, the maricones, these fags, and then walking around away or something like that. And also, before I continue to speak about my family, I do want to set something very clear. It's like my family and I are in great terms right now. They're wonderful. I love them. They're my number one supporters, and I love them dearly. But the journey there was not always great. But yes, returning to the story, another instance that I remember very vividly was my parents like to throw these parties for my dad's employees. And they hired this man who was an event planner. They called him a decorator. He basically decorated the whole space and all that stuff. But also kind of more was an event planner / decorator. Yeah. They called him behind his back El Pato, which is literally translates to the duck. But that's what people call gay people in Puerto Rico, patos. All right. So it's like saying like the fairy or look at those cream puffs or something like that. Like so in the same way the word pato is used to refer like we quack around and have feathers, you know?
Okay. Is that how it came to be? Because we quack around and have feathers? Yeah.
Yeah. If you think about it that way, it's kind of in that direction. Yeah.
Okay.
So my parents called this man El Pato and he was very flamboyant. And he also, unfortunately, died of AIDS. So I remember that this is like this man. I remember my family hired him, interacted with him, referred to him that way. He was never like a part of the family, a part of the group. They just kind of like used him for this one thing, which was make this space look beautiful so that we can throw a party in it. And then when he contracted AIDS, I remember my mom would help bring some food or something like that when he was in the hospital and he eventually died. And my parents didn't really talk about it that much. And then the last thing that I would say, which is something I was not aware of until way later, was that I have an aunt who's a lesbian and she had a partner for like 10 years before I came out. But we always knew her as her next door neighbor / best friend. And there was no indication whatsoever until years after I came out. My little brother was like, Auntie is a lesbian. I was like, what? She is? And I was very shocked by how much like our family like hid that from us and especially from me because eventually my family did find out that I'm gay. So,
Yeah. Well, I mean, it sounds like then this interesting experience within your family there. I hear a lot of love for people, for both the family and then people in general, with the example of your mom really wanting to offer care and offer food to this person that worked with them who was sick with AIDS. So I hear both kind of some either fear or unsure feelings about being gay, but also just wanting to still be in relationship with people and care for folks. What would you say does that feel accurate as a description for your family? Or
I think that's an accurate description. I think when you look at something like Christianity, which my parents are a part of, you have these teachings against homosexual sexual activity and relationships. But at the same time, you have these teachings about love thy neighbor and take care of the less fortunate. And so my parents, in a way, were kind of doing both. They were definitely exhibiting some forms of homophobia and heterosexism toward this man, but at the same time realizing that he was a part of the needy and the vulnerable, then they felt like they needed to rise to the occasion and help in some ways. So yes, a complicated journey. Yeah. There are many little stories here and there that I can share. Like my mom had a gay friend when she was in high school, never talked about him until later on. So my dad had like a bunch of male friends. They're all very much like the good old boys. You know, my dad is named after my grandpa and I'm named after my dad. So there's this tradition of passing on this masculinity. So there's a lot more in here, but it's definitely complicated. And there are moments where, I can tell my upbringing with regard to sexuality was never fully black and white.
Yeah, absolutely. So then walk us back to, 12-year-old you having that moment amongst your peers, kind of seeing, I feel a different thing than my peers. What happened next? The Catholic high school that I was in really did a great job at immersing us into our faith life. So I began really deepening my spirituality. And what that did was it made me try to ignore or suppress the idea that I might be gay. I figured first, it's a phase, it'll go away. Second, it's a sin. So I better not give this any more thought or fuel in any way. At one point I had a girlfriend in there. She told me, she was a neighbor who told me that she found me attractive. So I was like, I guess I'm just going to go ahead and go through these motions and date this girl. And this reminds me of your program, The Second Adolescence, right? Because certainly this repression, right, eventually led to a bursting of a gay identity in my 20s that was very much repressed in my teens. And so, yes, I'm in high school and that's what I begin to do. I begin to repress this identity. I begin to really focus more on my faith and on living out the duty and the tradition that is bestowed upon me by my faith tradition and my culture. It wasn't until I met this one young man, his name was Alejandro. It was before the Lady Gaga song, unfortunately. And I met this young man and he asked me very directly if I liked boys. And I took a chance and I said, yes. How old were you at the time?
This was me being 17. So this was maybe 5 years of me either having girlfriends and pretending or repressing. And we started a relationship. We started dating. And that's the first time I allowed myself to feel these feelings that had been so repressing, right? And the relationship started in a very innocent way. I remember conversations like, what do you like about me? And I was like, well, I like your smile and I like how you're nice. And it was, looking back on that relationship, was very young, very innocent, and very beautiful. But unfortunately, it wasn't. It was short-lived in that because my parents found out that I was dating him, and they found out because they picked up a phone line and listened in on a conversation that I was having through the house phone. Yes, unfortunately, sometimes one of the drawbacks or one of the things that I guess found myself oppressed under in Hispanic culture was the lack of privacy. So you can imagine a 17-year-old starting to explore a relationship, not even a month-old relationship, not even having the words. I hadn't even admitted to myself that I'm gay. All I knew was that I liked this young man and that I felt attracted to him and I wanted to explore it. And then suddenly was thrust into conversations about my sexuality that I didn't know how to answer. So my coming out was quite difficult. What happened was my dad came in and said, I listened to your phone conversation. And then my response to that immediately was, I think I like boys. And then that led to a lot of yelling and a lot of, how dare you say something like that. And then the months after that, there were constant fights about my sexuality, but also conversion therapy. So my parents enrolled, or not. It wasn't anything boarded like these extreme movies like Boy Erased or anything like that. But it was definitely going to therapy after school once a week. And a therapist would tell me that if I continued on this path, that I would be on an irreversible journey, and that Jesus would not like that. and that I needed to find ways to move toward the path of heterosexuality. And I did that. I tried that. I returned to dating girls. I broke up with this young man. And I did that. I was looking back on that experience, it was incredibly scarring and traumatic.
Absolutely.
And I remember a message I got, a threefold message I got that still haunts me to this day is, because you're gay, you're going to go to hell. You will never find love and you will never be successful. And those things were very drilled into me. Like, if you continue down this path, you will go to hell, never find love, and never be successful. And so to me, it is still, that's the three-part voice that still rings in my head whenever I either experience heartbreak or failure, or I hear a religious leader saying something condemning toward LGBTQ plus people. I think of that voice, and it's relived. So my teens and my sexuality were very difficult.
I mean, gosh, there's so many things I want to say. First off, I mean, thank you for sharing all of that. I think so much of your experiences, I think, is going to be shared by a lot of folks. And particularly this last bit you just shared about, essentially we all have these core wounds that often get laid onto us at different points in our younger years, particularly in our adolescence, that become our work to then throughout our life have to continue to unlearn. And particularly for us queer folks, so much of that is shame-based, related to our identity. But then as you're speaking to, they can take so many different forms and be so piercing. And again, just thanks for sharing, because I think that piece is really relatable. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is. It is. And a lot of my work in therapy, which I have been going to for like 4 years now, has been realizing how heartbreaking and exercising some compassion toward that younger part of me that never really got to have an adolescence, and returning here to your program, right? Having an adolescence, and how difficult and traumatic that was, for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the work. It sounds like you've been doing it, of revisiting our younger selves and offering the healing to them, offering the grieving with them to them, catching them when they're learning this belief about themselves, and helping them see there's a different way. And it's big work, but it's great to hear that work. It's like too much work, but no, it's such good work. It's such good work. Yeah, totally. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So then what happened after really going through this latter part of your adolescence, kind of forced into coming out before you were both ready to, but also had fully made sense of what your identity was? Sounded like that added a lot of friction in your experience with your family, and then going into conversion therapy. What happened next?
Well, what happened next was I graduated high school and moved to the States. I moved to Ohio, but I moved to a pretty progressive and welcoming school. And that gave me the opportunity to explore my sexuality without some of these voices. Some cool things that happened my first year. First, I went to confession with a priest, and I said, "Father, I'm going to hell because I'm gay." And the priest, who was more progressive, as a penance, right? The Catholic tradition has this idea that, like, you confess your sins. The priest, in the name of God, forgives you, but then gives you this penance, which is usually a set of prayers. And then you just kind of pray that. It's your way to, like, take something from this session to say, like, I'm going to continue to work on this, So his penance was to educate myself as to what it means to be gay and what the church teaches about it. And I remember being very shocked by that. I was like, well, I'm pretty sure I know, like, I'm going to hell. That's what I've been told. And then I started reading a little bit more, and this idea that there's a difference between an orientation and an action, that the church does not condemn gay people. The Catholic Church makes room for people to form their conscience, discern where God is calling them to live their life. And yes, while the church does have a strong teaching against same-sex activity and same-sex marriage, it also has pretty strong teaching on conscience and on following God's call. And with that deeper theology, I started really thinking about my faith in a different way. Those were small seeds, right?
Wow.
I was not steeped in Hispanic culture. As a matter of fact, the university I was in was 98% white. So I didn't have some of those influences. I wasn't trapped in a culture that had a particular mentality about machismo and all that stuff. Not that Ohio was that much more progressive, but at least it was different enough for me to be able to realize, like, because I found myself in a different culture, I was now able to understand that I was in a culture. If you grow up in an environment, you don't really realize that is very much a culture. You just think that that's how the way things are.
Right.
So that allowed me that awareness. And the third thing was that in one of my classes, there was this really cute boy behind me named Chris. And I thought he was attractive. And he said he was a ballet major. So I thought, gay. And then we started dating. And that was the time when I was like really able to again explore a relationship with a boy in my second semester of my frosh year in college. That relationship just lasted a couple of months. But yes, college was the time for me to really start deconstructing some things. It wasn't until my 20s when I started reconstructing something else instead. But yes, my college career, which was from 17 to 21, so it was that transitional year from my teens to my 20s, that a beginning of a deconstructing process. That was really important. My sophomore year, I entered a relationship with a man that lasted 4.5 years. We moved together to Hawaii after Ohio. I also had some spiritual directors who were very much encouraging me to think of Jesus as a gay man, not literally a gay man, but as a queer man. The idea that he was countercultural. He lived a life that was not what was expected. He blurred lines between the divine and the human, life and death. And so that's a queer way of looking at Christ.
Yeah.
And so as a transgressive force. And so then I started again deconstructing, but then reconstructing my faith. And through that separation from my family and my culture, my parents, we had periods of not talking. What happened with my family was that they started to realize that I am gay. And then I blatantly told them I'm gay, I'm staying gay, and I have a boyfriend.
Ooh, wait, how old were you when that happened? Where was that?
What was that? That was in between my sophomore and junior year. So that must have been 19, about to be 20. And I told them I'm gay, I'm staying gay, I have a boyfriend. And there was a period of not a lot of communication, only for money purposes or something like that. And it wasn't until my dad's dad died that I feel like the relationship started to my grandfather, that they started softening up, and then they started going to therapy themselves. And the therapist, I was in one of the first sessions because there were joint sessions, family therapy. And the therapist said that the way she works with families is her starting point is the reality of each person. And Ish is telling you that his reality is that he's a gay man. So we're starting there. And then my dad said, I don't know. I don't think that I can accept that. And then she said, and that's your work, not his work. And I am assuming that months and months later, my parents just slowly started coming around to the point where when I broke up with that boy that I did it for 4.5 years, my dad sent me a message saying, hey, I know you're going through a tough time, a tough transition in your life. Just know that I'm here for you. He also at one point sent an email apology for the way he treated me when I was young. So yes, it was right after, as I was graduating college and moving into my life as an adult in Honolulu, Hawaii, again, really far. That's when they started really coming around and expressing some more support.
Whoa, what was that time like for you when you were seeing this shift happening with your parents?
It was hope-filled.
Yeah.
A lot of gratitude. There are some things that I did not realize, which is how much work it was still going to take to actually forgive, how much work it was actually going to take to erase the things that happened before. I thought at that time naively, they apologize, they're coming around, things are going to be just peachy from now on.
Totally, right.
It wasn't really that way, but them trying meant a lot. During that time, I started seeing another man. So after I broke up with in that relationship, I then had a 3-year relationship with someone. And this man, I thought, he taught me how to love. And with him, I felt a lot of just integrity with regard to my culture, my faith, and my sexual identity. So with him, I remember having sex with him, finishing having sex, and then looking up at the sky and saying, thank you, God, for this wonderful man in my life. And so in a way, my relationship with him kind of helped strengthen my faith. And with him, significantly, my family invited him to Puerto Rico for the winter, for Christmas and in the summers. So then we would go there, and they met my at the time boyfriend, and seeing them interact really helped me start saying like I can be a gay Puerto Rican man. And so my early 20s were a beginning of that integrity, living a little bit more of an integrated life. Integration, that perhaps a better word than integrity and integration. Yeah.
Yes. And going back to what you laid out, this idea of deconstruction and reconstruction, I love that. And I'm going to be thinking about that a lot. And it sounds like the end result was finding a way to like integrate all these aspects of your identity and have them be true and okay. I am a gay Puerto Rican man of faith. I'm a gay Puerto Rican man, Catholic man, right?
Yeah. And you can't do that without deconstructing some of the oppressive narratives, right?
Yes.
So if you grow up in a Puerto Rican culture, that is sexist, machista, that is, that bullies LGBTQ plus people, that calls them pato, maricón, then that's your conception of what it means to be Puerto Rican or Latino, Hispanic. If you grow up in a Catholic church that tells you that gay people are going to hell, and that's your conception of what it means to be Catholic. And if you think that being gay is this horrible, terrible thing that makes us different and ostracized, and that's your conception of what it means to be gay. So I definitely had to deconstruct all of that and really start building an understanding of what it means to be Hispanic and Puerto Rican as community-oriented, service-oriented, an attitude of si se puede, yes we can, this optimistic, hopeful, working together attitude. The concept of family and community are central, right? And then there's these symbols. And if you have that, then you have symbols like food and music that point to that bigger reality of like, we're a part of this community that's bigger and that's vibrant and beautiful and joyful, rather than oppressive, sexist, and marginalizing, right? And the same thing with the Catholic faith. If you construct an understanding of God as a white heterosexual male judge, then you have God in one way. But if you can deconstruct that idea and in its place, generate a new understanding of a supreme being who is radical love that is transgressive, then you might understand your faith in a different way. So that was my early 20s. And honestly, while that new construction those foundations started being laid out in my early 20s, it wasn't really until I moved to San Francisco when I was 25, I believe, that foundation, that new construct began to really flourish and explode, because this city really allows people to construct an understanding of themselves as more integrated. And it was here where I met other fellow queer Hispanic Catholics. And I saw, we can do this as a community. And it was here when I saw, queer Hispanics, queer Catholics. I have like a group of gay Puerto Rican friends here. I have a group of gay Catholic friends here. And that's where I started now experiencing this integration as a community. And it was a messy process too, but the end result has led to a sense of actual pride and contentment with all the fullness of who I am. Not perfect, but at least a degree of contentment and pride.
Wow. Gosh. Again, I could just listen to you talk all day long. I'm so appreciative of you sharing your story. And it's just like, so that was all happening. There's been all this work around this integration of identity, finding yourself and owning that, then being immersed in a community that even further allows you to feel that within you. So that was all happening. I'm also curious, like maybe even backing up a bit, like what was your then process in terms of relationship? That was all happening within yourself and kind of your identity. But like, as you were like navigating dating and relationships when you were younger, and then kind of into like your 20s, moving to San Francisco, I know you mentioned kind of flagging in your adolescence, there was this repression happening. And then that later there was a need to kind of counter that or work through that. What was your journey there?
Okay, that one was a little bit more, that's where when I said that it was messy, that's where the messiness took place.
It always is messy. It's always messy for all of us. Yep.
I'm sure you and many of the listeners here might be familiar with Alan Downs' work on The Velvet Rage, where he talks about different stages that gay men go through. And the first being repression, the second one being a degree of like being out and proud with glitter and feather boas and all that stuff. But what's interesting about that is that he is still saying that while there's an external exuberant expression of gayness and gay culture, subconsciously, that is still a way to overcompensate for an internalized sense of shame. So that's what a lot of that process looked like. While I was, deconstructing all of these understandings, the process of deconstructing my identity really took a long time. It really took all of my 20s. And what did that look like? Well, it looked like this. I was now in a place where I could be out and proud, but I knew that deep inside of me, that voice that said that you will never be successful, never be loved, and go to hell was still very much present. I just wasn't really fully aware of how it was present. And that manifested itself in relationships. So I had a period of maybe like 2 to 3 years, where I had a lot of sex with a lot of people. I opened Grindr and I said, you know what, let's go around, let's meet people, let's explore my sexual self. My conscious mind was saying, you are doing this because you're proud of being a gay man and because you are really just now finally able to express and explore the sexuality that you've been repressing. My subconscious, however, was saying, at the end of the day, you really want to feel love and you don't feel like you are worthy of love. So you are constantly looking for this external validation. And to numb this pain,
Yep.
No way. And so it was messy. It was a messy process where I had to, but I accepted it, and I wouldn't change a thing. And I'm really proud of myself during that time too, because, I didn't engage in high risk behavior. I was on PrEP. I was, using condoms or protection as needed. I was having consensual sex. I was not inebriated. So it wasn't like a thing where I'm like, oh, let me completely destroy my life. No, it was more like my life is stable. I have a good job. I have a good faith community. I have a Hispanic community, and now I get to be a gay man. And because I had those stabilities, then I was able to, pretty safely, but also be exploratory. I was able to do that. But yes, two things were happening at once. Number one was that trying to be proud of myself, but number two was trying to numb that pain that was that voice. That all came to a head when I started realizing that having sex with all these men wasn't really filling the void that the subconscious was trying to fill. And that's when I started going to therapy. That was when I was 28 years old. And yeah, this therapist has really helped me understand these constructions and deconstructions that have taken place in my life, and really put into perspective, what kinds of actions and what kind of patterns I've created to protect myself, what kind of patterns I've created to try to fit in, to try to numb myself from feeling unworthy of love, understanding where the patterns came from, and then finally be able to, and that awareness is freeing, liberating, because now I'm aware of the pattern. I know that it is not a set way of being, but rather something that was created for a purpose. And then I can make different choices. My 30s have been a time where that integration, and that community has been really, really lived out in a much more fulfilled sense. That doesn't mean that I stopped sleeping around or anything like that, but it was a little bit more intentional, a little bit more connected, and I was a little bit more aware of what was happening. And I could say, oh, I feel like I could use some validation today. Yeah. Or, right now, I feel like I'm looking for validation. Let me find it some other way. Let me go to my friend's apartment instead and watch a movie. So these are things that I was able now to do in my 30s and have some and I was able to actually dedicate time to the relationships that I wanted to cultivate, rather than trying to just be all gay out and proud. And so that's kind of where I am right now, is just really dedicating time to the things I want to dedicate time to.
Gosh, wow. Yeah. What's that like for you in this moment, after going back through your story up until this point and seeing all that went down for you? What's that like?
I think the word that comes to mind is, I'm always afraid to sound a little cocky. I think I sometimes don't come off as a very humble person. But yeah, a sense of pride.
Hell yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Self-love, pride, self-worth. Those are the words that came to mind.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I don't mean that in a, sometimes there's this stigma about praising ourselves and being proud of who we are.
Sure.
So,
right. But you I'm thinking, I'm still thinking about 17-year-old you and going through everything with your parents, finding about your relationship, and then navigating what it means to be a gay Puerto Rican man, a gay Catholic. You did a ton of work, and you talking about the deconstruction and reconstruction, holy smokes, I would be proud too. I must be so interesting for you to think back to kind of who you were and how you were back at 12, 17, 24 now, and just seeing that evolution. What I also love doing sometimes, I always get curious, what would it be like for our younger selves to see us now, and what would they think? And that's a whole other piece. What do you think that would be for 17-year-old you to see you now? Because how old are you now?
I'm 32.
32. 17-year-old you to see 32-year-old you. What do you think he'd think?
I think you would find comfort. I think you would find hope. There was always hope. I think 17-year-old me always had a little bit of hope that things would eventually be better. I think of some of the young people that I sometimes work with or know who struggle with mental health, suicide, and all the unfortunate statistics that we now hear that our younger LGBTQ plus siblings suffer through. I didn't necessarily suffer through those in the same way. Any sort of mental health issue I wasn't really aware of when I was younger, and any sort of, if I ever contemplated anything serious such as suicide or anything like that, it was definitely very fleeting and not a serious thought. So I think that part of me, the young-ish, always had hope, but maybe if I were 17 and I were to look at myself or know what I would be like at 32, that hope would drive me to a little bit more decisive action. I would have come out sooner. I would have been a little bit more secure of myself. I would not have drank the conversion therapy Kool-Aid, those other things. But then maybe I would not end up where I am right now at 32. So, when you were saying like, oh, it must be so great to look back on all of this and like realize this, like, and this is again, just touching on your project, is I wonder how much in common this experience is. I wonder how many of us gay people, gay men, and or other members of the LGBTQ plus community have had some sort of similar journeys, some similar themes. Well, the second adolescence itself, right? We don't get to explore our sexualities through relationship fully in high school. So we have to do that in college. I mentioned that I am an educator and I work with LGBTQ plus youth. And I noticed that some of the young people these days are very much having an adolescence that is quite similar to their cisgender heterosexual counterparts.
Yes.
And so I wonder two things. Part of me is grateful because I'm like, I wonder if these students are going to not have the same traumas that we are now having to work through. But then the other part of me wonders if they're going to have the resilience and the sense of self that only comes from these scars that we've had to treat and heal through decades. So I wonder how the LGBTQ, that's how their lives right now is how it should be. The community, our community should not be traumatized. We shouldn't have to leave our families to find ourselves. We shouldn't have to do that. But I wonder, always looking for the silver lining, I wonder how our community would be different if we didn't have to go through that. So.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't wish upon anybody any suffering and to have to navigate through trauma, particularly, the trauma of shame that is part of so many of our queer stories and how insidious that trauma can be. And as you're speaking to, it does often, when we can really be with that shame and work with these wounds and come out on the other side with it, not necessarily through it because it stays there and the work is continuous, of course, but come out on the other side of that pain, there is this resiliency and there is this strength that is so pervasive in the greater queer community. And that's what makes it really powerful to be a part of this community, to find other folks who we've all been through it in some way. And there's also a lot of strength amongst us all. It's very cool.
I agree. I think if I could choose to be born gay again, now at 32, I would totally do it again. I don't think I would have said the same thing at 17, even at 20 or 25. But at 32, I've loved this journey and I've loved the wonderful people I've gotten to meet. I love this idea, right, that the queer community has of chosen family, the idea that we form a family wherever we are. My parents, as I said, have significantly come along. I've brought 3 boys home and I'm bringing my current partner home over the holidays. They're going to meet this person who's really dear to me. And it's really wonderful. This one time I was applying to a job in Philadelphia and I was considering moving from San Francisco to Philly. One of the questions my dad asked was, does Philadelphia have a gayborhood? I was like, well, Dad, actually, thank you for asking. It does. Why'd you ask? And his response was, you need that stuff. Like, I understand that you, and by you, I think he meant me, but also I think he meant us, like queer people. We need these spaces where we can create our own community and create our own chosen family. And that moment was a moment of being seen by my dad, who realized it's like, oh my gosh, I had to leave, but then I created my own family here in San Francisco with my gay Puerto Rican friends, my gay Catholic friends, and half of Grindr in the Castro. But, like chosen family is chosen family regardless. Sure.
Wow. Gosh. And like you're speaking to this being seen by our people, being seen by our families, our parents, like those moments are so powerful. It's everything. It's what we're needing.
I agree.
That's like the antidote to shame, is like being seen and loved for what shame previously told us was not okay.
Yeah, we had to hide. Absolutely. 100%. Yeah. And what's important too is that this process of like daring to be seen, because being seen, you have to put something out there for it to be seen, right?
Hell yeah.
And I'm thinking, all these young gays that moved to the city, they still come here. Like, back in the 60s, Harvey Milk time, 70s, they came here trying to find a place and they knew to come to San Francisco. That's still happening. Like, a lot of people are leaving places and they're coming here. They're choosing to come here so they can do that. And, contrary to being Black or being a woman or being any sort of other form of demographic where you realize who you are from an early age, like our sexual orientation, our queer identity is, with exceptions, right? But by and large, something that's largely discovered later in life during puberty. And then with the rejection that's experienced, that means that we don't have mentorship. So that's why programs like these with the Second Adolescence, I think work like Alan Downs' work is so important, because to a degree, all of us, I'm talking about us as we were older gays, us gays in the 30s, the daddy gays in their 30s. We have a responsibility to help the people going through the first and second adolescence, the younglings, I call them the gaybies, navigate this world, which is, it has its wonderful things and its dangerous things as well. So that's why I'm so passionate about projects like these. It's because I realized like older gays carried me through when I was in my 20s. Yeah. And now I feel like now that I have something built, it's important to look back and see, there might be younger gays who are looking for these chosen families, and they might benefit from understanding how some of us did it.
Gosh. Well, on that note, that feels like a good place for us to wind down. But God, I want to talk with you all day on this topic. I'm taking personally so much away from this conversation. And I am really excited to have it marinate. And I feel so much gratitude to you for coming on and sharing your story. I think as you spoke, I was just seeing how there's going to be so many moments that I think are going to be both relatable for folks, but also as an invitation for folks, as someone who's done the work like you've done, to start to really, maybe there's more places where they can further examine their experience and see, is there more healing that I need to do? And is there more things I can deconstruct and reconstruct? Powerful. So again, just thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. This was so great.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. And thank you for all of your projects and all your work. I think it'll bear wonderful fruit for many people in their lives. So thank you so much.
Yeah. So if any of the listeners want to follow up with you or reach out after hearing your story, what's a good place they can connect with you?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Thank you for asking that. So one of the things I want to share is that on top of my practice as an educator, I actually do offer conversations, consultations, or simple guidance on mostly questions of Catholicism and inclusion for LGBTQ plus people. So a good way to reach me is via email. And my email is ishruiz11@gmail.com. So that's ishruiz11@gmail.com. And if anyone wants to talk about what it's like to be queer and Catholic, I'm always open to having that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you and the work you're doing in this world and sharing your story. Awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. And likewise.
Well, thanks, folks, for joining us for this conversation. Feel free to head on over to secondadolescencepod.com for show notes and resources highlighted in today's episode. And you can connect further by following the show on Instagram at Second Adolescence Pod. If you're interested in being a future guest on the show and you want to come on and share about your own second adolescence, visit secondadolescencepod.com and you'll see how you can submit your interest there. I'd love to have you on. All right, that's it from me. Whether it's morning, afternoon, night, wherever we're finding you in your day, please go out there, keep doing things that would make younger you feel absolutely stoked. That's what it's about. All right, take good care.